Justice has a price, and sometimes karma comes collecting. Los Angeles, a city of wealth, power, and opportunity. But beneath the polished skyscrapers and designer storefronts lies a brutal reality. Not everyone gets a fair shot. If you're born into privilege, the world opens its doors for you. If you're not, it slams them in your face. And if you're black, struggling, and unseen, the system doesn't just ignore you. It grinds you down until you disappear. Meet Elijah Carter, a 14-year-old black boy who has already learned the hard way that society wasn't built for kids like him. Alone, homeless, and surviving on scraps, he has no choice but to navigate a world that sees him as a nuisance at best and a criminal at worst. Every day is a fight, not just against hunger and exhaustion, but against the people who believe he doesn't belong, the ones who make sure he never gets back up. And at the center of his torment is Karen Whitmore, a wealthy, entitled woman who sees herself as the gatekeeper of her city. To her, Elijah is nothing more than trash on the sidewalk, something to be swept away, erased, forgotten. She humiliates him, sets the police on him, turns the entire neighborhood against him, all because she can. But what happens when the powerless find an unexpected ally? When the tables turn? When the boy she tried to destroy is revealed to be someone far more important than she ever imagined. Because injustice never goes unnoticed forever. And some people, no matter how invisible, are never truly alone. This is a story about power, cruelty, and consequences. About those who think they can get away with anything, until the day comes when they pay the price. Do you believe that karma is real? Do you think justice will finally be served? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories where the underdog rises and the villain falls, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Now let's begin. Los Angeles was a city of two worlds. The glitz and glamour of towering skyscrapers, high-end boutiques, and bustling cafes, and the unseen, the forgotten, the invisible souls surviving in the shadows. Elijah wasn't supposed to be part of that latter world. At least, that's what he had always told himself. But here he was, no more than 14 years old, navigating the cold, unrelenting streets with nothing but a tattered hoodie, an old backpack, and a hunger gnawing at his ribs like a relentless beast. Every morning, he woke up in the narrow alley behind a closed-down bakery, tucked between stacks of old cardboard. His first task was always the same: scour the streets for recyclables, bottles, cans, anything that could earn him a few cents. Today was no different. The sun was barely beginning to rise, casting a dim golden glow over the city. The world of the wealthy was still asleep, but for Elijah, it was already a battle for survival. He crouched near a trash bin outside an upscale cafe, his fingers numb as he rummaged through discarded cups and plastic containers. He found a half-filled bottle of water and tucked it into his bag. He had long learned to appreciate every drop. Then he heard it, a sharp, disdainful voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade. "You again?" Elijah barely had time to react before a forceful shove sent him stumbling backward. His back hit the cold pavement, his palms scraping against the rough ground. He winced but didn't cry out. Crying never changed anything. Above him stood a woman he had seen before, but never this close. Karen Whitmore. Tall, thin, dressed in an expensive beige trench coat that looked like it had never seen a speck of dirt. Her manicured fingers clutched a designer purse, and her eyes, a piercing shade of icy blue, burned with disgust as she stared down at him. "I told you to stay away from this area," she sneered, stepping closer. Elijah could smell the overpowering perfume she wore, artificial and suffocating. "You think you belong here? Digging through our trash like a filthy rat." Elijah gritted his teeth and slowly pushed himself up, his body aching from the fall. He had encountered people like her before, the ones who looked at him and saw nothing but a nuisance, an eyesore in their perfect world. But Karen was different. She wasn't just cruel, she was relentless. "I'm just trying to survive," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. Karen scoffed, her lips curling into a smirk. "Survive? By stealing from decent people." "I'm not stealing," Elijah shot back. "I'm collecting bottles." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't talk back to me, you little thug." Her voice dripped with venom. She suddenly pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "Let's see if the police believe your little sob story." Elijah's stomach twisted. He had been harassed before, but he had never been arrested. He knew how these things went. A kid like him, black, homeless, defenseless, was guilty before proven innocent. He considered running, but his legs felt heavy, and deep down, he knew there was nowhere to go. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of an LAPD cruiser pulled up to the curb. A uniformed officer stepped out, his expression unreadable as he approached. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, glancing between Karen and Elijah. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head as if she were the victim. "This boy has been lurking around for days. Stealing, harassing customers. He's making everyone feel unsafe." Elijah's heart pounded against his ribs. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice firm but edged with desperation. The officer barely looked at him. Instead, he turned back to Karen. "You're sure he was causing trouble?" "Absolutely," she said smoothly. "And I have security footage to prove it." That was a lie. Elijah knew it. But it didn't matter. The truth had never saved kids like him before. The officer exhaled and turned his gaze to Elijah. "Do you have any ID?" Elijah shook his head. "No figures," the officer muttered. Karen crossed her arms, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "You should take him in. Teach him a lesson." Elijah felt a deep, suffocating weight press against his chest. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the thought of being thrown into the system or the way Karen looked at him, like he wasn't even human. The officer sighed as if he couldn't be bothered with this mess. "Look, kid, I don't have time for this. Get out of here before I change my mind." Karen's lips pursed, clearly displeased with the lack of immediate punishment. "He'll just come back," she said sharply. Elijah didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed his backpack and turned on his heel, walking away as fast as he could without running. His hands trembled as he clenched the straps. He had gotten lucky this time, but he knew Karen wasn't done with him. She had power, influence, and she was determined to make his life hell. That night, as Elijah curled up in his alleyway shelter, he stared up at the sky, the city lights drowning out the stars. His stomach ached with hunger, but the fear twisting inside him was worse. He had survived another day, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep surviving Karen. Elijah woke up to the sound of footsteps echoing through the alleyway, his body stiff from another night on the cold pavement. His stomach growled, but hunger was the least of his problems. The confrontation with Karen the day before lingered in his mind like a bad dream, except he knew it was far from over. She wasn't the kind of person who let things go, and deep down he had a sinking feeling that she was already planning her next move. Shoving his few belongings into his tattered backpack, he made his way toward the commercial district, hoping to collect enough recyclables before store owners started chasing him off. However, something felt off. The usual indifference he received from shopkeepers had been replaced by open hostility. The moment he stepped onto the sidewalk near the cafe where he had been harassed, a barista glanced up from behind the counter, narrowed his eyes, and immediately stepped outside. "Hey, you again," the man snapped, pointing a finger at Elijah, as if he were a known criminal. "I don't know what scam you're running, but you need to get the hell out of here." Elijah hesitated, his heart sinking. "I'm just picking up recyclables." "I'm not, don't lie." The man cut him off, pulling out his phone. "That woman already warned us about you. Said you've been harassing customers, trying to steal from the registers." Elijah's breath hitched. Karen. She had done exactly what he feared. His fists clenched as he shook his head, his voice laced with frustration. "That's not true. I never." The barista took a step closer, his expression hardening. "I don't care. The manager said we're banning you from the area. Next time you step foot here, we're calling the cops." A few customers at the nearby outdoor tables turned to stare, some whispering to each other, their judgmental eyes scanning him as if confirming Karen's accusations. Elijah's chest tightened, humiliation burning through him, but he knew arguing wouldn't change anything. Without another word, he turned away, gripping his backpack straps so tightly his knuckles turned white. As he walked down the street, he saw more of the damage Karen had done. A few shops had signs in their windows that read "No loitering." But as he passed, store employees would step outside and glare, making it clear the rule had been written for him. Even a small corner market where he sometimes bought day-old bread at a discount had a new sign taped to the door: "No service for trespassers." The owner, a graying man who had never paid much attention to Elijah before, stood outside, watching him with narrowed eyes. "Don't even think about coming in here," he warned. The message was clear. He was being pushed out. Karen had poisoned the entire neighborhood against him, leaving him nowhere to go. His usual routine, collecting recyclables, trading them in for a few dollars, getting scraps of food where he could, had just been ripped away from him in less than a day. His stomach twisted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to despair creeping in. With nowhere else to turn, he decided to head toward a different part of the city, one he had always avoided. The industrial district was known for being rougher, less forgiving. It was where the more dangerous homeless groups claimed their territory, where stepping into the wrong alley could mean getting jumped or worse. But without access to his usual spots, he had no choice. By the time he reached an abandoned construction site where he hoped to find scrap metal to sell, the sun was high, beating down on him mercilessly. He ducked under a chain-link fence, carefully making his way through piles of discarded debris when a sharp whistle cut through the silence. Elijah froze. 3 men, rough-looking, with sunburned skin and ragged clothes, emerged from the shadows, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a stocky man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, crossed his arms. "You lost, kid." Elijah knew better than to look weak. He straightened his posture and tried to keep his voice steady. "Just passing through. Looking for scrap." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Bad luck for you then. This is our spot." The tallest of the 3, a wiry man with missing teeth, smirked. "You're new here, so we'll give you a choice. Pay up, or we teach you a lesson." Elijah's pulse quickened. "I don't have anything," he admitted, gripping his bag tighter. The scarred man sighed dramatically. "That's a shame." Before Elijah could react, a fist slammed into his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping, but the second man grabbed his hoodie, yanking him upright. Another punch, this time to his ribs. Pain exploded through his side as he collapsed to his knees. Laughter echoed around him as the third man stepped closer, his boot landing a sharp kick to Elijah's side, sending him sprawling onto the dirt. His body screamed in agony, but he didn't cry out. He had learned long ago that showing pain only made things worse. "Let this be a warning," the scarred man muttered before spitting on the ground near Elijah's face. "Stay out of our territory." The group turned and walked away, their laughter fading into the distance. Elijah lay there for a long moment, his breathing ragged, the world spinning around him. His ribs throbbed, and his stomach churned with nausea. He had nothing. No food, no shelter, no safe place left in the city. He had hit rock bottom, and there was no one coming to help him. Elijah dragged himself out of the alley, his ribs aching with every breath, his vision slightly blurred from the blows he had taken. He had survived worse, or at least that's what he told himself. His body screamed for rest, but he couldn't afford to stop. The city wasn't kind to those who slowed down. He clutched his backpack, feeling the weight of its near emptiness, and forced himself toward the only place he could think of, a small parking lot on the outskirts of downtown, where he had been sleeping for the past few weeks. The owner was an older man who barely paid attention to him, as long as he didn't cause trouble. It wasn't much, just a spot behind a dumpster where the wind didn't hit as hard, but it was the closest thing Elijah had to safety. However, as he approached, he noticed something different. The usual indifference of the lot's workers had been replaced with something much worse: hostility. The moment he stepped onto the cracked pavement, a man in a security uniform turned toward him, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward. "You can't be here," the man said flatly, his hand already moving toward the radio strapped to his shoulder. Elijah's heart sank. I'm not causing any trouble. I just need a place to rest for the night." The man shook his head, eyes cold and unmoving. Not my problem. You're banned from the property. Elijah's grip on his backpack tightened. Since when? The security guard let out a slow breath, as if he had been expecting the question. Since your little stunt with Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. She made some calls. Showed us the kind of trouble you bring. Management doesn't want you here anymore. A pit formed in Elijah's stomach. Karen. She wasn't just making his life harder. She was making sure he had nowhere left to go. His throat tightened as he took a step back, his mind racing for options, but there were none. If he argued, the police would be called. If he stayed, he'd be dragged away. His hands balled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to turn around and walk away. Humiliation burned in his chest, but he couldn't afford pride anymore. He just needed to find somewhere else before the night swallowed the city whole. The streets stretched endlessly before him, each shadow a reminder of how alone he truly was. His feet carried him toward the only other place where he could get relief, St. Mark's Shelter, a small soup kitchen that handed out meals to the homeless. It wasn't much, but it was a warm meal and a chance to sit without looking over his shoulder. The building came into view, its faded brick walls offering a small glimmer of hope. The line wasn't too long tonight, and the smell of soup drifted from inside, making his stomach clench with longing. He stepped forward, pulling his hood lower over his face as he moved toward the entrance. But before he could take another step, a woman in a red apron blocked his path. She was one of the volunteers, someone he had seen before, though she had never paid him much attention. Tonight, however, her gaze was sharp, and her lips pressed into a firm line. "We're full," she said, crossing her arms. Elijah blinked. "What?" "That's not, we're full," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Try somewhere else." A cold wave of realization crashed over him. This wasn't about space. There had been nights when the line stretched around the block, and they still let people in. He took a step back, shaking his head. Karen did this, didn't she? The volunteer's expression didn't change, but the flicker of recognition in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said stiffly. "Now please leave before I have to ask someone to escort you out." Elijah's jaw clenched as he turned away, his hands shaking with frustration. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Karen had done it again. She had poisoned yet another place that had once given him even the smallest bit of comfort. His stomach twisted painfully as he stepped back into the cold night, hunger gnawing at his insides. There was nowhere left. No shelter, no food, no place where he wasn't seen as a problem to be erased. His legs carried him aimlessly through the streets, past neon-lit windows of restaurants where families laughed over meals, past towering buildings where people slept in warm beds without a second thought. He hated them, not because they had what he didn't, but because they never even noticed that people like him existed. The city moved on, uncaring, while he faded further into its cracks. Elijah woke to the biting chill of the early morning air, his limbs stiff from sleeping on the cold, unforgiving ground of the park. His stomach ached from hunger, his throat dry from lack of water, and his entire body felt like it was running on the last remnants of energy he didn't have. The city was starting to wake, cars rumbling down the streets, people emerging from their homes and stepping into cafes to start their day with warm coffee and fresh pastries, while he sat curled against a bench, invisible to everyone. He had to move. He had to find food. He had to find something to keep himself from collapsing. With slow, aching movements, he forced himself to his feet, slung his nearly empty backpack over his shoulder, and started walking. He avoided the parts of the city where he knew he wasn't welcome, but it didn't leave him with many options. His old routine, collecting bottles, scavenging for scraps, finding places where he could blend into the background, had been ripped away from him piece by piece. He was a ghost in his own city, tolerated nowhere, unwanted everywhere. The hunger was unbearable now, a deep, gnawing pain that made his hands shake. He had gone without food before, but this was different. This was the kind of hunger that made his vision blur, his legs weak, his thoughts hazy. A commotion near the cafe, where he had first encountered Karen, snapped him back to reality. The street was bustling with morning crowds, businessmen in tailored suits, women in high heels carrying designer handbags, and servers balancing trays of expensive breakfasts. At the center of it all was Karen Whitmore, standing with a group of well-dressed friends outside her favorite cafe, laughing, talking, sipping mimosas as if the world belonged to them. Elijah's chest tightened. He should have walked away, should have turned down another street, but something inside him refused. He was tired of running. He was tired of being erased. His steps were slow and deliberate as he approached, keeping his head down, his hood up, his shoulders hunched against the weight of every eye that glanced in his direction with suspicion. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He just needed food. He just needed something to keep him going. A server passed by carrying a tray of half-eaten plates, the scent of eggs and toast making Elijah's stomach clench painfully. His eyes locked onto a barely touched croissant resting on the edge of the tray. It was instinct more than thought. His fingers darted forward, snatching the piece of bread just as the server turned. A sharp gasp rang through the air, then silence, then the unmistakable sound of laughter. Karen's voice cut through everything else, a cruel, mocking edge laced into every word. "Oh, look," she sneered, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. The little street rat is still crawling around. Elijah gripped the croissant tighter, his pulse hammering in his ears. His throat burned with the urge to defend himself, to explain, but he knew it wouldn't matter. It never did. Karen thrived on power, on making people feel small, on ensuring that no one ever challenged her. She tilted her head, a smirk curling her lips. "You're actually stealing food in broad daylight? In front of all these people?" Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and heads turned, eyes filled with either amusement or disgust. "I wasn't," Elijah started, but before he could finish, Karen reached for the tray the server was holding, grabbing a half-full plate of food, and, without hesitation, dumped its contents over his head. The cold, slimy texture of eggs and soggy toast slid down his face, soaking into his already filthy hoodie. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one stepped in. No one said anything. The humiliation was instant, burning through him hotter than any hunger he had ever felt. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body trembling. Karen leaned down, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "You don't belong here," she hissed. "And I'm going to make sure you never forget that." Elijah's breath came in ragged, uneven gasps as she straightened, flashing another one of her perfect, calculated smiles to the onlookers. "Someone should really do something about these people," she said, shaking her head in mock disappointment. "They ruin everything." The crowd murmured in agreement. Elijah stood frozen, his face burning, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to run, to disappear before she did something worse. But she wasn't finished. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a $1 bill. "Here," she said, holding it out between two fingers like it was covered in dirt. "Since you're so desperate." Elijah looked at it, his body rigid with humiliation and rage. He didn't move. Karen's smirk widened. "No, suit yourself." With a flick of her wrist, she let the bill drop to the ground at his feet. A sharp, cruel laugh rang from one of her friends. He should be grateful. Elijah turned and walked away. His mind was blank, his body moving on instinct alone. His heart pounded so hard it hurt, his face still burning from the stares, from the laughter, from the feeling of food dripping down his clothes. He walked until the sounds faded behind him, until he was alone again. His fingers curled into fists as he yanked off his hoodie, throwing it to the ground. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the handful of coins he had saved from the little money he had managed to collect that week. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was all he had. Then, out of nowhere, a foot shot out, kicking his hand with brutal force. The coins scattered across the pavement, bouncing and rolling before slipping through the metal grates of a nearby storm drain. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the empty space where they had been, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Karen's voice came from behind him, light and casual, as if she had done nothing more than step on a bug. "Oops. The laughter still echoed behind him, the cruel taunts of Karen and her friends blending into the distant hum of the city. But his mind barely registered anything beyond the crushing weight of loss. He had nothing. No money, no food, no shelter, no dignity. His hands shook as he forced himself to move, his legs heavy, his breath shallow, his chest tightening with something far worse than hunger. Rage. For the first time, he felt it consume him entirely. It wasn't just anger at Karen. It was anger at everything. At the city that refused to see him, at the people who stepped over him like trash, at the system that had left him to rot, at the cruel twist of fate that had stolen everything from him before he even had a chance to fight for it. His vision blurred, but not from tears. His body was too exhausted for that. He turned, not knowing where he was going, only knowing that he had to move before he lost what little control he had left. The streets passed in a haze, his feet carrying him aimlessly until he found himself near the cafe again. He didn't mean to come back here. He should have avoided it. But his legs had carried him forward without thought. And now he was standing in the same spot where Karen had humiliated him just hours before. His stomach twisted violently, but he ignored it. His head ached from exhaustion, his body screaming for rest, but there was nowhere left to go. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw her. Karen stood a few feet away, scrolling through her phone as she leaned casually against the hood of a sleek black car, her designer coat draped over her shoulders like a queen surveying her kingdom. She wasn't paying attention to him. She didn't have to. In her mind, he wasn't worth noticing anymore. She had already won. Elijah's entire body tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He should have walked away. He should have left before she saw him. But something in him snapped. His feet moved before he could stop them, his steps slow but deliberate, his entire body rigid with unspoken fury. Karen glanced up at the last second, her eyes locking onto his with something between amusement and irritation. "Oh," she said, tilting her head, her lips curling into a smirk. "You're still here?" Elijah didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to. Karen sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Honestly, I thought you'd have learned your lesson by now." She pushed off the car, taking a slow step toward him, her expression carefully calculated. "You don't belong here, Elijah. You never did. And I think it's about time someone made sure you understood that." Her hand moved before he even realized what was happening. One moment, she was standing in front of him. The next, she was screaming, stumbling backward, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place, her phone clattering to the pavement. Elijah barely had time to process the shove before the sharp, piercing sound of a police siren filled the air. "Help!" Karen shrieked, clutching her arm, her eyes wide with something that was almost impressive in its theatricality. "He attacked me." Elijah's blood ran cold. Everything happened too fast. A cop car screeched to a stop just feet away, doors flying open as two officers rushed toward them. He barely had time to step back before rough hands grabbed his arms, yanking him off his feet, forcing him to the ground as his face slammed against the pavement. The pain barely registered. "Stay down," one of the officers barked, his knee pressing hard against Elijah's back, making it impossible to breathe. Elijah tried to speak, but the pressure against his ribs cut off the words before they could leave his mouth. The world spun around him, the sounds of the city fading beneath the ringing in his ears. "I didn't," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," the officer snapped, tightening the cuffs around his wrists until they bit into his skin. "I don't want to hear it." Karen sniffled dramatically, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. He just came at me," she said, her hands shaking as she hugged herself. "I was so scared." The other officer turned to her, his expression softening instantly. "Did he threaten you?" Karen hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. "Yes." Elijah's stomach twisted. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, wanted to tell them that she was lying, that she had been the one to shove him first, but he knew it didn't matter. His word meant nothing against hers. The next few minutes passed in a blur. He was hauled to his feet, shoved into the back of a police car, the door slamming shut behind him. Through the tinted glass, he saw Karen watching him, her arms crossed, satisfaction clear in her eyes. She had won again. The ride to the station was silent. His wrists ached from the cuffs, his ribs throbbing from where the officer had pressed into them. He didn't ask where they were taking him. He already knew. By the time they reached the precinct, the exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, dulling everything except the crushing weight of inevitability. The officers didn't ask him any questions. They didn't even read him his rights. They just shoved him through the booking process like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then they threw him into a holding cell. The air was thick with a stench of sweat and desperation. The walls were covered in scratches, initials carved into the concrete by people who had come before him, people who had probably been just as powerless as he was now. Minutes passed, maybe hours. He didn't know. Then the cell door creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped inside. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Elijah's stomach twist. "Get up," the officer ordered. Elijah hesitated, his body sluggish, his limbs too heavy to move. The officer didn't wait. He reached down, yanking Elijah to his feet with enough force to make his vision swim. "You think you're tough," the officer muttered, his grip tightening. "Think you can just walk around this city like you own it?" Elijah barely had time to react before the first punch landed. Pain exploded through his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs, making his knees buckle. He gasped, but the officer didn't stop. Another blow, this time to his stomach, then another, each one precise, practiced. By the time the officer finally let go, Elijah collapsed to the floor, his body trembling, his breath ragged. "Next time," the officer said, adjusting his cuffs, "stay in your place." Elijah lay on the cold floor of a holding cell, his body aching, his ribs burning with every shallow breath, his vision blurred from exhaustion and pain. The officer who had beaten him was gone, leaving him curled up in the corner, barely able to move, barely able to think. The fluorescent light above him flickered, casting harsh shadows against the cracked concrete walls. His mind was empty, his body too drained to feel anything beyond the dull, persistent ache of survival. Time passed in fragments, moments bleeding into one another, until the sound of metal scraping against metal pulled him from the haze. The cell door creaked open, and another officer, this one younger, less cruel, stepped inside. His expression was unreadable as he tossed a paper bag onto the floor. "Food," he muttered, then turned away without another word. Elijah stared at the bag, his stomach twisting painfully, but he didn't move. He knew what this was. It wasn't kindness. It was routine obligation, a scrap thrown to a stray dog before being kicked back onto the street. He waited until the officer left before forcing himself to sit up, his muscles protesting every movement. He reached for the bag with trembling fingers, tearing it open to reveal a dry sandwich, a bruised apple, and a bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in days. He ate slowly, mechanically, each bite feeling like a battle against his own exhaustion. By the time he finished, the reality of his situation had fully settled in. He wasn't getting out of this because someone believed in his innocence. He was getting out because he wasn't worth the paperwork. They didn't care if he was guilty or not. They just wanted him gone. Hours later, when the cell door opened again, he barely reacted. The same young officer stood there, holding a clipboard, his expression blank. "You're free to go," he said flatly. Elijah didn't move at first, his mind struggling to process the words. Free? The word felt hollow, meaningless. But he forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady, his head spinning from dehydration and fatigue. He followed the officer down a long hallway, past desks cluttered with papers, past other cells filled with men who looked just as broken as he felt. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged him. He was just another case number being processed out of existence. When they finally reached the exit, the officer handed him a plastic bag containing his backpack and whatever few belongings he had left. "Stay out of trouble," the officer muttered, then turned away, leaving Elijah standing alone on the steps of the precinct. The city stretched out before him, bright and indifferent, moving forward as if he had never existed. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust, the distant sounds of car horns and chatter filling the night, but everything felt muted, distant, like he was watching the world from behind a pane of glass. His feet carried him forward, not because he had a destination, but because stopping meant collapsing. He walked for what felt like hours, his body screaming for rest, his mind numb, his vision swimming in and out of focus. The hunger was still there, gnawing at his insides, but it was secondary now, overshadowed by the sheer weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like an anchor. People passed by him without a second glance. Couples laughed as they walked hand in hand. Businessmen hurried toward late meetings. A group of teenagers sat outside a convenience store, scrolling through their phones, oblivious to the boy staggering past them like a ghost. No one cared. No one ever had. His legs finally gave out near an intersection, his body crumbling onto the pavement as if it had simply given up. The world tilted, the city lights blurring into a swirl of colors, his breath shallow, his skin damp with sweat despite the cold creeping into his bones. His hands trembled as he tried to push himself up, but his arms were weak, useless, his strength long gone. Then, as if the universe wasn't finished crushing him, a familiar voice sliced through the haze. "Oh wow, you look terrible." Elijah barely had the energy to turn his head, but he didn't have to. He knew that voice, knew the sharp mocking tone, the false sweetness dripping from every syllable. Karen Whitmore stood above him, her heels clicking against the pavement as she took a slow, deliberate step closer, her lips curling into a smirk. He forced himself to lift his gaze, his body trembling, his breaths shallow. Karen looked immaculate, as always, her tailored coat cinched perfectly at the waist, her blonde hair falling in effortless waves over her shoulders. She tilted her head, feigning concern, though the amusement in her eyes betrayed her. "You know," she mused, crossing her arms, "I really thought you'd be gone by now. Guess you're more stubborn than I gave you credit for." Elijah tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, his body too weak. His fingers dug into the pavement as he tried to push himself upright, but Karen simply sighed, shaking her head in mock disappointment. "This is just sad," she said, crouching down so that they were almost eye level. "You're pathetic, you know that? Clinging to life like some stray dog no one wants." She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a neatly folded bill. For a moment, he thought she was going to do what she had done before, drop it at his feet like a piece of trash. But instead, she smirked and slowly, deliberately tore it in half. "Oops," she said lightly, letting the torn pieces flutter to the ground. Elijah's vision blurred again, but not from exhaustion. Karen straightened, brushing non-existent dust from her coat before glancing down at him one last time. "You really should just disappear," she said, her voice almost gentle. "No one wants you here." The torn remains of the dollar bill fluttered beside him, a cruel reminder of how far he had fallen, of how much Karen had taken from him, of how easy it was for her to destroy whatever little dignity he had left. People passed by without a glance, their conversations, their laughter, their lives moving forward as if he didn't exist, as if he was nothing more than a stain on the sidewalk. Somewhere deep inside him, the smallest ember of resistance still burned, but it was weak, flickering, barely enough to keep him breathing. He knew he couldn't stay here. If he didn't move, the cold would seep into his bones, the hunger would finish what Karen had started, and he would become just another forgotten body lost in the city. With trembling hands, he pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and unresponsive, his stomach clenching from emptiness, his head spinning as he forced himself to stand. His feet carried him forward, not because he had a destination, but because standing still meant accepting defeat, and some stubborn, fractured part of him refused to give Karen that satisfaction. He walked until his legs ached, until his breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, until the streets blurred together into an endless maze of indifference. By the time he reached the commercial district, the sun had climbed high into the sky, casting long shadows between the towering buildings, the heat pressing against his already weakened body like an unbearable weight. He hadn't meant to end up here, hadn't wanted to come anywhere near the places where Karen had control, but his body had moved on instinct, seeking out anything familiar, even if familiarity only meant more pain. He kept his head down as he stepped onto the sidewalk in front of one of the high-end department stores, his entire body tense, his instincts screaming at him to leave before someone noticed him. But it was too late. A sharp, clipped voice rang out, slicing through the murmurs of the passing crowd. "You." Elijah froze, his stomach twisting violently as he slowly turned his head, already knowing what he would see. Karen stood near the entrance of the store, dressed in an immaculate white blazer, her expression unreadable, but her eyes filled with something dangerously close to satisfaction. Next to her, a uniformed security guard stood with his arms crossed, his gaze cold and unfeeling, waiting for her command. For a brief second, Elijah considered running, but his legs felt like lead, his body too exhausted to fight, his mind too numb to process anything beyond the overwhelming certainty that whatever happened next would break him completely. Karen took a slow step forward, tilting her head as she studied him, her lips curving into a small, knowing smirk. "I warned you, didn't I?" she said, her voice soft, almost gentle, as if she were speaking to a disobedient child. "I told you to disappear. And yet, here you are, still polluting my city with your filth." The security guard shifted beside her, cracking his knuckles, his stance widening slightly, preparing to act. Elijah's entire body tensed as Karen lifted a manicured hand and pointed directly at him. "Get rid of him," she said simply. The guard didn't hesitate. Elijah barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed his arms, yanking him backward, forcing him off balance as his already weak legs buckled beneath him. The ground hit hard against his knees, pain shooting up his spine as the guard tightened his grip, his fingers digging into Elijah's skin with bruising force. The people around them barely spared a glance, their indifference cutting deeper than the guard's hands ever could. "Don't fight," the guard muttered, his breath hot against Elijah's ear, his tone laced with quiet amusement. "It'll only make it worse." Karen sighed, checking her phone, her expression one of mild boredom, as if this entire ordeal was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Make sure he doesn't come back," she said dismissively, already turning away, already moving on with her perfect, unshaken life. Elijah clenched his jaw, swallowing back the bitter taste of rage and humiliation as the guard hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the alley behind the store. His mind screamed at him to fight, to resist, to do something, but his body was too weak, too empty, too broken to listen. The guard shoved him hard against the brick wall, the rough surface scraping against his skin as pain exploded through his shoulder. "Stay out of this area," he warned, his voice calm but firm. "If I see you again, I won't be this nice." Elijah didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was too tight, his breath too shallow, his entire body too heavy with the weight of everything Karen had taken from him. The guard gave him one last shove before stepping back, adjusting his uniform like nothing had happened, then walking away, leaving Elijah slumped against the wall, his hands shaking, his vision blurring again. For a long moment he stayed there, his mind blank, his heart pounding weakly against his ribs. Then, slowly, he forced himself to move, pushing off the wall, dragging his body forward, his steps slow and unsteady as he made his way toward the only thing he had left, his backpack, his one possession, his last connection to anything that still felt like his. But when he reached the alley where he had left it, his breath caught in his throat. A small group of teenagers stood in a loose circle around the pile of tattered fabric, their laughter echoing off the walls, their faces lit with cruel amusement. One of them held a lighter, flicking it open and closed, the small flame dancing between his fingers. Elijah's stomach dropped as realization hit him like a fist to the gut. "No," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, but it was too late. The lighter dropped. The flame spread instantly, consuming the fabric, curling around the edges, turning everything he owned into ash. The boys laughed, their voices distant, distorted, like they were coming from underwater. Elijah stood frozen, his entire body numb, his mind refusing to process what was happening, what had already happened, what couldn't be undone. Elijah sat motionless on the cold pavement, his body hunched over the smoldering remains of his backpack, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The flames had long since died, leaving behind only blackened fabric and the scent of burned synthetic material. But he could still hear the laughter, still see the flicker of fire reflecting in their eyes, still feel the weight of Karen's cruelty pressing down on him like an unbearable force. His fingers twitched against the ground, but he had no strength left to clench them into fists, no fight left to give, no hope left to hold on to. The world around him moved forward, people walking past without a glance, the city continuing as if nothing had happened, as if he didn't exist, as if he never had. His body screamed for rest, for food, for relief from the endless suffering, but there was none left to find. The thought crept into his mind, slow and insidious, whispering to him that this was it, that this was where his story ended, that there was no point in standing up again, no point in moving forward. Then a shadow fell over him. Elijah. The voice was deep, steady, commanding, without being harsh. It cut through the numbness like a sharp blade, forcing his exhausted mind to register that someone had spoken his name, that someone had seen him. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. A man stood before him, tall and imposing, dressed in a tailored black suit that spoke of wealth and power, but without the arrogance of the people Elijah had learned to fear. His face was strong, lined with age and experience. His dark eyes sharp yet filled with something Elijah had not seen in a long time. Recognition. Concern. Elijah Carter. The name hit him like a physical force, his breath catching in his throat, his body locking in place. He had not heard his full name in years. He had not thought of himself as anything more than another lost soul on the streets, another forgotten existence, another stain on the perfect city Karen Whitmore had built around herself. But this man knew him. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, confusion and disbelief battling against the exhaustion that had threatened to consume him only moments ago. His voice barely worked, but he managed to rasp out, Who are you?" The man's gaze didn't waver, his expression unreadable yet unwavering. "My name is Elias Carter." The name meant nothing to Elijah at first. His mind was too fogged, too broken, too worn down to make the connection. But then, like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place, he remembered. The whispers on the streets, the stories he had overheard when he still dared to hope, the rumors of a billionaire real estate mogul who had built half the city. Elias Carter, a man who rarely showed his face in public, a man who didn't waste time on people like Elijah, a man who had no reason to be standing here now, except he did, because he had called him by his full name, because he had looked at him like he knew him, because Elijah Carter wasn't just some random kid on the streets. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave, too much, too fast, too impossible to process. He tried to stand, but his body failed him, his knees buckling beneath his weight. Before he could hit the ground, strong hands caught him, steadying him with surprising gentleness. "You're safe now," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've been looking for you for a long time." Elijah wanted to speak, wanted to ask 1,000 questions, wanted to understand what was happening, but his mind was still reeling, still trying to grasp that any of this was real. Then Karen's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "What the hell is this?" Elijah flinched instinctively, his body tensing at the all-too-familiar venom in her tone. He turned his head slowly, exhaustion dragging at every movement, and saw her standing at the entrance of the alleyway, her perfectly polished appearance slightly disheveled, her face twisted in fury. Elias barely acknowledged her. His eyes remained locked on Elijah, his grip unwavering, his stance unshaken. "This," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made even Karen hesitate, "is the end of whatever little power you thought you had." Karen's eyes flickered with something Elijah had never seen before, uncertainty. It lasted only a second before she straightened, her lips curling into a sneer. "I don't know who you think you are," she snapped, stepping closer, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, "but this little rat has been a stain on my city for far too long. He's nothing. He's no one." Elias turned his head then, finally looking at her, his expression unreadable, but his presence overwhelming. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Karen scoffed, folding her arms. "Yes, that's so. And if you're here playing the hero, let me give you some advice. Stay out of it. He's just another homeless thief looking for a handout." Nothing you do will change that. Elias was silent for a moment, studying her, letting the weight of his gaze settle over her like a storm waiting to break. Then he spoke, his voice steady, final. Elijah Carter is my nephew. The world seemed to stop. Karen's smirk faltered. For the first time since Elijah had met her, she looked truly shaken. What? She breathed, barely more than a whisper. Elias didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The words hung in the air, undeniable, irreversible, a truth that shattered every illusion Karen had built around herself. Elijah's mind reeled, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps as he tried to comprehend the impossible. Nephew? The word felt foreign, distant, unreal. He had no family, no past, no future. But Elias Carter was standing here, claiming him, protecting him, lifting him from the depths of the world Karen had buried him in. Karen's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, her carefully constructed world cracking with every second that passed. The weight of Elias Carter's words hung in the air, suffocating, undeniable, inescapable. Elijah Carter is my nephew. The sentence echoed in her mind like a death knell, stripping away the certainty, the arrogance, the untouchable power she had always believed she possessed. Her lips parted, her mind scrambling for something, anything, to counter what had just been said, but nothing came. The crowd that had started to gather in the wake of the confrontation was no longer whispering about Elijah. They were whispering about her. Elias took a step forward, his presence towering over her, his gaze calm but filled with a quiet authority that left no room for defiance. You thought you could break him, he said, his voice measured, unwavering, carrying the weight of a man who had already decided the fate of his enemy. You thought no one was watching, that no one cared. He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes never leaving hers. You were wrong. Karen forced herself to straighten, to push back the rising panic clawing at her throat. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, she snapped, her voice sharp but unsteady, her hands curling into fists at her sides. But this changes nothing. You can dress him up, throw money at him, pretend he belongs in your world, but it won't erase the truth. He's nothing. He'll always be nothing. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out a sleek black folder, and held it up for her to see. This, he said, flipping it open, says otherwise. Karen's eyes flickered to the documents inside, her breath hitching in her throat as she recognized the header, the official seal, the neatly typed lines of text that detailed numbers, names, transactions. Her stomach turned to ice. I had my team do some digging, Elias continued, his voice calm, almost conversational, though the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the same woman who spent years parading herself as the face of charity, of social responsibility, of class, had been siphoning money from the very foundations she claimed to support. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, shifting from curiosity to something darker, something sharper, something Karen had never heard directed at her before: doubt, suspicion, contempt. That's a lie, she snapped, but her voice wavered, her face pale, her carefully applied mask of control slipping. You can't prove anything. Elias tilted his head, his smirk slow and knowing, his fingers tapping against the folder, before he lifted a single sheet of paper and turned it so that she, and everyone else watching, could see. You signed this yourself, he said, his tone almost pitying, as if he found her desperation amusing. Diverting funds meant for homeless shelters into private offshore accounts. Clever, really. If only you hadn't gotten greedy. Karen's entire body went rigid, her breath shuddering out of her lungs as the whispers turned into full-fledged voices, the people she had once walked among with effortless superiority now staring at her like she was something rotten, something beneath them. A woman in a pearl necklace, someone Karen had shared champagne with at fundraisers, took a slow step back. Karen, she murmured, her tone laced with something close to disgust. A man in a crisp navy suit shook his head. Tell me this isn't true. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. You built your reputation on lies, Elias continued, closing the folder with a quiet snap, tucking it back into his jacket as if the matter had already been settled. And now those lies are the only thing you have left. Karen's chest rose and fell rapidly, her pulse hammering against her ribs as the weight of the stares, the murmurs, the judgment pressed down on her like a suffocating force. She turned, looking for a familiar face, anyone who might still be on her side, but they were already stepping away, their gazes hard. Their loyalty severed the moment the illusion of Karen Whitmore crumbled. The final blow came when the owner of the boutique behind her, the very store she had spent thousands in, the place she had once considered an extension of her own status, stepped forward, arms crossed. "We don't serve criminals," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Karen's breath caught in her throat. "You can't, you should leave," the woman interrupted, her expression cold. "Before we call security." The words hit harder than any physical strike. Karen stumbled back, her hands trembling, her mind racing for a way out, a way to reclaim control. But there was none. The world she had built for herself, the power, the influence, the respect, was gone, slipping through her fingers like sand, leaving her with nothing but the sharp, cruel reality of her own downfall. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to twist the knife deeper, her phone buzzed in her pocket. With shaking hands, she pulled it out, her stomach dropping as she read the message flashing across the screen. Eviction notice, property foreclosed. The ground beneath her felt unsteady, the noise around her a dull roar in her ears. Her house, her sanctuary, her proof that she was better than the people she despised, was gone. She turned back toward Elias, toward Elijah, toward the boy she had tried to erase, but there was nothing left to say. The world she had ruled with cruelty and control had discarded her as easily as she had discarded the people she deemed unworthy. She had no home to return to, no bank accounts left to drain, no friends to call, no stores to walk into without being met with glares or outright rejection. She wandered the streets in clothes that were no longer pristine, heels that had long lost their shine, hair that no stylist would touch. The city she once commanded had become her prison, and every step she took was a reminder of how far she had fallen. Days passed in a blur of hunger, exhaustion, and the kind of shame that wrapped around her like a suffocating fog. She had spent years ignoring the desperate faces that lined the streets, turning her nose up at the hands that reached for spare change, pretending that their suffering was a choice rather than a consequence of a world designed to chew people up and spit them out. Now she was one of them. She slept where she could, curled up on benches that offered no comfort, beneath awnings that did little to protect her from the elements, in alleys that smelled of the very filth she once believed only others carried. She scavenged for food, her pride long since shattered, her stomach twisting with a hunger she had never known before, the same hunger she had laughed at when she saw it in Elijah's eyes. The people who had once hung onto her every word now avoided her, their eyes skimming over her as if she no longer existed. She had become invisible in the same world she used to rule. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting the city in hues of orange and gold, she sat on a cold concrete step outside a convenience store, her body aching, her hands trembling from the chill that never seemed to leave her bones. The door swung open, the familiar sound of footsteps approaching, and she looked up out of instinct. Elijah stood before her, the boy she had tormented, destroyed, left to suffer alone. The boy she had once believed was beneath her, now standing tall, his frame no longer frail, his presence no longer something she could ignore. He was dressed in clean, well-fitted clothes, nothing flashy, but unmistakably expensive, the kind of clothing that belonged to someone who had a future, someone who had escaped the cycle she had tried to trap him in. His face held none of the fear, none of the desperation, none of the helplessness she had once thrived on. Karen's breath hitched as she struggled to form words, to find the remnants of the woman she used to be, but she found nothing. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly, and she was no longer the one standing above him. She was the one on the ground, looking up, hoping for mercy. Elijah didn't speak immediately, his dark eyes studying her, not with hatred, not with vengeance, but with something far worse, pity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it between his fingers, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. Karen's lips parted. shame flooding through her in waves, her pride screaming at her not to take it, but her stomach twisting with hunger, her hands shaking from cold, her entire existence hanging by a thread. Elijah crouched slightly, bringing himself to her level, his voice quiet but firm. "You always told me I was nothing," he said, his words slow, deliberate, cutting deeper than any insult ever could. "That I didn't belong, that no one cared." He tilted his head slightly, the smallest trace of a smirk ghosting across his lips. "How does it feel?" Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry, her hands frozen in her lap as she stared at the bill, as she felt the weight of her own words crushing down on her, suffocating her, dragging her further into the abyss she had created. Elijah let the moment stretch, giving her time to understand, to feel the lesson she had refused to learn for so long. Then, without another word, he let the bill slip from his fingers, watched it flutter to the ground between them, and stood up. Karen's breath came in ragged, uneven bursts as she stared at the money, her body frozen, her mind screaming at her to reach for it, to snatch it before the wind carried it away. But something inside her refused to move. She had spent her life throwing money at problems, using it as both a weapon and a shield, but now it sat on the dirty pavement between them, a symbol of everything she had lost, of everything she could never buy back. Elijah gave her one last look, then turned and walked away, his posture relaxed, his shoulders squared, his future his own. Karen didn't call out to him. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply sat there, staring at the money she couldn't bring herself to touch, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was truly, completely alone. The end. If you enjoyed this story of justice, redemption, and the downfall of a villain, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping stories. What was the most satisfying moment for you? Did Karen deserve her fate, or do you think she should have gotten an even harsher punishment? Let us know in the comments below. Also, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We love seeing our audience from all around the world.